Hello, welcome to Podsongs. I'm Jack Stafford, and I interview inspiring people in service to others as inspiration for a new song. Today's episode is with the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK, CND. If you're going to campaign for anything, make it nuclear disarmament, because it's the greatest threat to us, the planet, and every life stream on it, not just if the bombs do go off, but already with the testing. It's insanity incarnate. So let's get some counselling from Catherine Hudson.
See some of the junk in my room showing. I'm not sure there's anything I can do about that.
No, well, it's just audio. I'm in a phone-backed room, so...
Yeah, no, of course.
How are you today?
Yeah, very well. What about you?
Very good. I'm here in Italy.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Whereabouts?
I'm opposite the Amalfi Coast.
Oh, wonderful. Opposite? Now, what does that mean? You're on an island?
No, well, the coastline's really curved, so I look out the window and I see Capri and the Bay of Naples. You wouldn't like it. No.
Oh, no. I went on holiday to Ischia once.
Yeah.
Really lovely.
Yeah, that's just, you can see it on a very clear day.
I'm a bit envious now.
You wouldn't like it. It's too hot. It's too hot.
I could manage.
No, honestly. I think you're better where you are.
Well, if only. Let me just get rid of that. So it's some people making that noise. What is that? There you are. Great.
So what I'd like to... We have an hour today, is that right?
Yeah.
Great. I'd just like to learn from you about where we are, because I've been interviewing quite a few guests about climate change and global warming, and this is now seen as this is occupying people's minds as the existential threat. But so nuclear weapons and the danger is kind of off most people's radar, but it's still very present. Now where is the Doomsday Clock at the moment?
100 seconds to midnight.
100 seconds.
Yeah. Now, that's the closest it's ever been, even at the height of the Cold War. I think they introduced it in the late 40s, early 50s, and it's never been closer than it is now. I mean, isn't that unbelievable?
You're joking.
No.
So why is it so close now?
Well, actually, interestingly, even though it's done by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists over in the US, so like atomic nuclear is their expertise, they've basically taken into account what they call the two great existential threats, which is nuclear war, but it is also the climate emergency as well. So they, above all, have kind of integrated the two things together in their understanding. You know, they say there are many other problems. Obviously, when they were setting the hands this year, they thought there's the pandemic, but is that an existential problem? No, it's not an existential problem, because people can recover from it. You can have vaccines, maybe you can have treatments and so on. So people are very concerned, but it's not something that can destroy the whole of humanity, all life species and so on. And the two things that can do that are nuclear war and the climate emergency. So they've really got those two things tied down. I mean, it's really interesting, if people want to know more detail, that what they write about it is so well informed, so expert. They bring all kinds of other things in, like fake news, anti-science stuff, which they say that's really bad because it prevents democratic accountability and discussion of issues and people being able to make choices about what happens to them in the future. It's all a kind of an attack on us all being able to live a decent, safe life,
So they're really adding and minusing seconds depending on all these different factors.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking because I know last time when they made it 100 seconds to midnight, obviously it was the kind of accelerating climate change, but also it was Trump at that time, pulling out of treaties, arms control treaties and things, ratcheting up the kind of nuclear threat. So I thought that as they made the decision for this year after he'd been unelected, so to speak, maybe they might pull it back a bit, but they didn't feel that they could because of the climate change issue. And they want to see, is Biden, he says he's going to go back into treaties. Is he going to do that? So it's like too soon to say we're on a safer track, but at least it wasn't closer. That's the bonus.
You think with Trump's finger on the button or carrying the briefcase that we'd be a lot better now he's gone?
Well, yes. No, I think we are. Obviously Biden's still, now he's got that there, but nevertheless, he's part of the kind of mainstream establishment, which isn't particularly unpredictable, whereas Trump was unpredictable, and he would say stuff, he'd do his tweets, he'd, say he wasn't going to do stuff by the book, he'd get in a rage, he'd sack people, whatever. So I'm glad he hasn't got his finger on the button. But on the other hand, no finger is safe on the button, is it? Really?
No, it shouldn't even be a button, should there?
No, absolutely. Yeah, I can tell you're a strong CND supporter there.
I've got an appointment to talk to Lawrence Krauss, who was he chaired the Doomsday Clock for a while, I think. So anything you'd like me to ask him?
Well, I suppose my thing is always, do they think it's possible to have change? Because they identify all the problems, and they're really good at that. But do they think, given their understanding of, like our societies and all that, and the political processes, because they seem to be very clued into that as well, do they think it's possible to pull back from those dangers? Can human beings learn from experience? Can they learn from mistakes? I don't know. You like to think you can, don't you? I think I can. Obviously, everyone thinks they can. But when it comes down to it, why are governments still making weapons of mass destruction that cost hundreds of billions of pounds? But, for example, in our case, the NHS wasn't ready for a pandemic, even though they knew pandemics were on the horizon.
So you're quite involved with, because in Britain have Trident, these submarines. Is that the only nuclear weapon system in?
Yeah, we just have the one. We used to have some what are called freefall bombs that you just have on planes and then you just drop them, a bit like in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay. So we used to have some of those. But I think it was in the early years of Tony Blair, I think. But, like in the late 1990s, Britain got rid of those and they just put all their eggs in the submarine basket. So we've got 4 nuclear-powered nuclear weapon submarines. They carry missiles that we get from the US, and the missiles, if you launch, when you press the button, the nuclear button, it launches the missile, and on the missile are warheads.
Okay.
So it's a 3-part platform, so-called. The submarines that carry them round, the missiles that carry the bombs to their target, and then the bombs which have the nuclear explosion. So there's those 3 parts. So
wow. Yeah, you must be an expert by now in nuclear, more than you want to be, perhaps.
I'm sort of an expert, but in terms of like the deep science, then I would refer to people who are kind of like nuclear physicists, obviously. But in terms of like the knowledge I need to understand the systems and what they can do, yes, I've got that. So I know that with the total combination of our nuclear weapons, each one is 8 times the power of the one that was dropped on Hiroshima. So calculating for the bigger explosion, our arsenal could kill around about 320 million people, because nuclear bombs, they're always targeted on cities, because you wouldn't target on a hill, would you? In the country,
makes sense.
So they used to be called city busters, these big bombs, carried from nuclear submarines, and they would just have the most devastating impact. And of course, not only when they're dropped themselves, because sometimes people say, well, why are you so obsessed with nuclear? There are other big bombs that are used, and that's true. There were those, the mother of all bombs or whatever that was used in the Middle East, which wasn't nuclear. But the unique difference with nuclear is that it has this radioactive dust. Fallout, that's the word, yes. So it goes off and it releases a massive amount of radiation, which then goes out into the atmosphere. So if you look at Hiroshima, for example, I think around about 120 or so thousand people were killed from the bomb itself and the blast at the time, and there's a firestorm and all that sort of thing, terrible. People die of their wounds, burns, and immediate radiation. But then over the subsequent years, you have tens of thousands more dying of things like cancer and related illnesses from the radiation poisoning. So it's like a kind of a conventional, massive, great big thing, and like a biological weapon as well.
Right. Two in one, yeah.
Of course, it gets into your system, and then your children can have birth deformities as a result, genetic problems. So that's why we particularly focus on this, because we say that it is uniquely damaging.
But so probably too big a subject to talk about Russia and America. I mean, one won't disarm until the other one does. But could not Britain, take a lead with these tridents? Do you think, how close on your own personal clock are you to the British government deciding that they're not going to renew Trident?
Well, they have already made that decision. In 2016, Parliament voted that Trident should be replaced. Okay, so we've got, like we're talking before, we've got the 4 submarines, the warheads, the missiles, and at a certain point they get to the end of their shelf life.
Okay.
So Parliament made a decision that should be renewed. The cost of that is at least £205 billion, lifetime cost of the system. And of course that goes up and up the whole time. So that's going on, that they've already made that decision to do so. But in terms of other countries, I mean, you mentioned the US and Russia. They have the biggest arsenals, but very positively, because of an arms agreement that they had between them. It was something that was signed by President Obama and President Medvedev around about 2009-10, round about that time. They signed this thing called the New START Treaty, which was a bilateral reductions treaty, and it was a kind of successor to a previous one. So they've been reducing bilaterally their stocks for quite some time. So the number of nuclear weapons is coming down globally. And then one of the things recently, it was coming up for renewal, and President Trump said he didn't want to renew it. He'd already pulled out of other arms control treaties. He said he didn't want to renew it. But then, and the Russians were very keen to renew it. Why would they want to go into a kind of new Cold War situation where they have to start making more nuclear weapons? No one in their right mind wants to spend more stuff, So anyway, Biden and Putin have now extended the treaty, or renewed it for another 5 years. So those reductions will continue. The problem is, at the same time as some reductions taking place, other countries are developing new ones at the same time. So it's like maybe you've got a fleet of cars, for example. You get rid of some because they're old and a bit decrepit, but you buy in new ones, so to keep your fleet up to date. So that's a bit what the situation is with the nuclear weapons stuff. But one of the other things that President Trump did, because Obama had put on hold the idea of having any new nuclear weapons systems, because actually he was sort of pro global nuclear disarmament, But obviously that doesn't mean he wanted the US to get rid of all of its nuclear weapons at once straight away on its own or anything like that. But he did have as a kind of concept the idea of a nuclear weapons-free world, and he talked about it quite a lot. Of course, so then he put kind of further developments on hold. But of course, when Trump came in, it was, we've got to upgrade and do new things. And he had this nuclear posture review in which he talked about making usable nuclear weapons and having a greater number of scenarios in which you would use them.
Oh, dear.
So over the years, over the decades, the thing about nuclear weapons, which you'd all often hear, you still hear our politicians saying it, we have them in order not to use them. It's a deterrent, so we don't use it. It's just to deter other people from using theirs against us. So there was this kind of, well, in the Cold War, it's called mutually assured destruction. Like neither side would use them because they would know that, both sides, they would each be destroyed. I mean, what I always say, well, if you have them in order not to use them, why not just not have them and not use them? It seems a kind of unnecessary step to actually have the nuclear weapons. But anyway, Trump, what he did was he passed his new nuclear posture review saying that we'll have what he called smaller nuclear weapons so they could be usable. But I mean, small was still actually bigger than the Hiroshima bomb. But then he actually produced them. And, in his last year or whatever, they've actually been out in submarines going around, out there deployed. So not a good idea. One of the things about Biden is that he has said that he's opposed to such bombs because he think, like many people, I think that it lowers the threshold of the possibility of use because people think, oh, it's just a small thing, I'll just use that. But then someone fires back and then someone fires another one and so on. And then you escalate till you're using the big ones. So he's not keen on those. So hopefully he won't pursue further developments in nuclear weaponry. And there's also a big debate going on in the US Congress at the moment about how much money to put into nuclear weapons and whether they should make a new warhead or not. So there's actually, unlike Britain, where you don't actually really in Parliament get to discuss and debate this properly, they are having a real Barney over there about it, and hopefully they'll decide that they don't want to go ahead. But it's one of our government's less good moments. It was reported the other day that our defence minister or whatever, one of the top brass, had been lobbying the US Congress to make a decision to have the new warhead because we want it over here for our new replacement system. So, I mean, what's going on when Britain is trying to get the US to make new nuclear warheads? I mean, yeah, it's a bit crazy, really.
The mind boggles.
I know. Maybe it's part of Boris Johnson's global Britain concept, where, because when he made the big spending announcement for MOD in the autumn, it was like Britain's going to project itself as a great power sort of thing, going back to imperial glories. Well, why do they have to think that's about weapons of mass destruction? Britain could be a force for good in the world or whatever by not cutting its aid budget, for example, or by helping to get rid of climate change. There's all kinds of ways in which Britain could do good things or look good or whatever without it having to be about killing people.
So how would you counter this argument with if you got to speak to some of these generals saying, there's Iran or there's North Korea, we need to have weapons because of these new countries. What would you say to that?
Well, I'd say what actually many senior military people actually think, and we know this because quite often retired generals and field marshals, they actually come out and say, Trident is militarily useless, it should be scrapped. I might think, let's spend the money on health and education or something. They say we want it for conventional forces, but that's fine. That's a different set of priorities. But they can see that it's not. There's no point in having such things. But overall, most people recognise that it is too dangerous to have nuclear weapons in the world. And people like Henry Kissinger, for example, who was, he's a great hawk in the Cold War, wasn't he? I mean, good case for saying that he's a war criminal around the Vietnam War, for example. But he came to the conclusion about 15 to 20 years ago that the world was just too dangerous a place to have nuclear weapons, and the world should be pulling back from them. And he argued a very strong case that the US should stop relying on them, should stop having them as such a strong feature in their kind of security plans and strategies and so on. And he and others want to see a kind of a moving away from nuclear weapons and orientating towards other forms of security and defence and so on. And the view that's put forward by people, like senior people at the United Nations, is if some countries say they need them for their security, like say Britain, we say we need nuclear weapons for our security, why shouldn't other countries have them too? Wouldn't they come to the same conclusion, that they need nuclear weapons too, if that's what makes you safe? So why should Britain and a small number of nuclear weapons states have them and others aren't allowed to have them? So I mean, it's a kind of craziness, really. There are 9 countries with nuclear weapons. All the rest don't have them. In fact, at least half the world is self-organised into nuclear weapons-free zones. So pretty much the entire global south has organised itself into legal treaties to be nuclear weapons-free, which also excludes other countries' nuclear weapons from coming there and so on. Other parts of the Northern Hemisphere as well, places like Central Asia, Mongolia, all kinds of different places have organised in that way because they think that nuclear weapons are just so dangerous they should not be allowed. And that's what people have to understand. Now the problem with senior political people on the whole, or some of them, is that particularly in Britain, they see nuclear weapons as related to status, okay? And they think Britain needs to look strong in the world, I mean, Tony Blair used to say things like, Britain needs to be a heavy hitter and all that kind of thing. And, and that's in many people's view, that's the thing, and they seem to think that having nuclear weapons is part of punching above your weight in the world, rather than, doing other things. But of course, the problem with that is that, I mean, just in practical terms, not in kind of, principles about nuclear weapons, what it means is that in a place like Britain, which hasn't got loads of extra money swilling around in the public purse, you have to make choices about what you spend the money on. Okay, so in terms of the defence budget, you have to make choices, but also it all comes out of the same pot ultimately, doesn't it? Which is what we, the taxpayers, provide. If you're spending a lot of money on nuclear weapons, you're not spending it on health and jobs and dealing with climate change or regenerating the economy, say for sustainable development and all that kind of stuff. If you're prioritising putting money into a weapon that is supposed to be never used and which actually only makes you a target, what kind of planet are those people on? Because no nuclear weapons will be targeted on countries without them, will it?
No.
They will only be targeted on countries that do have them. So having them just makes us a target,
Well, maybe that's why we'll put them in submarines and they'll be a long way offshore, so nobody will shoot.
Well, yeah, maybe. But I mean, everyone else's weapons are targeted on cities. So, well, you'll be all right because you're in the Italian countryside.
Oh, I'm okay. I'm not worried for me. I just get the nuclear winter will blow over this way and kill all the olive trees.
That's the other thing, which is why most countries are very angry about nuclear weapons, because it's not like, okay, well, Russia and the US have got them. Let them just strike each other and that's their fault. That's up to them. It blows about, and so everyone would be affected. And there's was a lot of research done over the last decade by climate scientists as well as medical scientists and so on about the impact of even just a small nuclear exchange. Say India and Pakistan, for example, had a small nuclear exchange. In actual fact, such an exchange would so affect the climate that billions of people would die from starvation, because it would reduce the temperature and knock out the grain-producing areas of the world. So there wouldn't be enough food produced, so billions of people would die of starvation. I mean, that's me putting it in not very scientific words, but essentially that's what it is. And it's because of things like that that we've actually had this amazing initiative recently called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And this came into force at the UN in January. And basically, the countries that don't have nuclear weapons were so angry about the failure of the nuclear weapon states to disarm, even though under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they're obliged to disarm. They're so angry about lack of progress that they went to the UN and they negotiated a new treaty to ban nuclear weapons. And that came into force in January. And that was led by the countries of the global south, who are already in nuclear weapons-free zones, because they know that if you have these crazy people in the north letting off their bombs, all their populations are going to be affected by it. Many people will die. So they're trying to shift the narrative, shift the legal framework to, carry the outlawing of nuclear weapons, through to actual abolition of nuclear weapons.
And can they do that? Are they putting pressure on?
Well, it's interesting because the nuclear weapons states, when the treaty was being negotiated in the UN, they were very hostile to it. And in fact, there was one point, I think it was like the final negotiations going on, and the ambassadors to the UN from the US and the UK were standing outside the conference hall, kind of abusing people who were going in and, saying, we're never going to support this, it's a waste of time, it's destructive and all that kind of thing, and it will set back nuclear disarmament. I mean, just bonkers stuff, really. So that was their reaction, and our government has said we will never sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But I mean, actually, if you had a government like next time or 10 years' time that would support it, they will support it. A government can't bind what happens in the future. But anyway, they've been hostile to it, and they say, oh, it's irrelevant, it's not going to affect anything because the nuclear weapons states aren't going to sign up. But on the other hand, they spent quite a lot of time trying to bully countries into not ratifying it. Even in last autumn, when they were getting towards the 50 ratifications needed for it to come into force, they were writing letters. It was released. Agence France Press Agency released a letter that they got hold of, which was, US, I think, telling countries not to sign up. And all the NATO states were told by the US and UK, don't sign this treaty, because a couple of the European members were quite supportive of the idea. So they know that it is going to have an impact. So, for example, ways in which it might have an impact, obviously, in terms of investment, for example. So we know that some companies, big investment companies, banks, pensions and all that sort of, the pension funds are now looking at withdrawing from nuclear weapons stuff, because they see that under international law, even though it doesn't cover all countries, it is now illegal. And it's not just the possession of them or the use of them, it's the manufacturing, transportation, production, and all that sort of thing. So any element of it is illegal. So companies obviously don't want to find that they have invested in something or have got money in something which is illegal. So they are starting a divestment process, so that will have an impact on it. So there are all kinds of almost like behind the scenes ways in which it will have an impact and start to kind of hold stuff back, which is really positive.
That's great. Also, that's one of the...
There's another thing as well, which is that there's such a thing as a legal norm or something, that it... So even though countries may not have signed up to it, the fact that it is out there in international law and many other countries have signed up, it starts to be something it's recognised that nuclear weapons are illegal. So it starts to have an impact on international law and the kind of conducting of international law. So it's the start of a process, quite probably a long process, but nevertheless, it is ongoing and it's a practical thing.
That's great. Yeah, it's funny because it's a small group of people inside the British government, for example, doing all of this, and it's just it's probably a small group of people on the other side working against it, and people like you making a huge difference. So, that's,
well, we try, but actually, even though there may be a relatively smallish number actually actively involved, when you look at public opinion, it's overwhelmingly on our side.
Yeah.
So even though I'm sure the government and maybe some political parties, they think, Labour's a classic in my opinion. That they think at the top that they have to look tough on nuclear weapons because otherwise the Tories will say they're softies and weak on defence, and then they'll lose votes. Well, actually, we did this opinion poll in January just to mark the coming into force of the ban treaty, and it showed that I think it was something, I don't have the exact figures on me, something like 77% of the population were opposed to nuclear weapons and thought there should be global abolition of nuclear weapons, and it was like in the 70%, I think it was like something like 71% of Conservative voters thought there should be global abolition of nuclear weapons, and 83% of Labour voters thought there should be abolition of nuclear weapons. So that's like not even like members, but like their voters. So if the overwhelming majority of voters in the two main parties think there should be global abolition of nuclear weapons, why do they think they have to have nuclear weapons in order to look tough and get votes? I mean, it's like, haven't they looked recently at what people think is important?
I guess it's one of these legacy ideas that it's already existing, so it's much easier to keep it going. If you try to introduce it now, you can make a bill in Parliament, say, I've got this idea, it's going to cost about 200 billion. We're going to have these 4 submarines floating around with nuclear weapons. We're not going to use them. That idea would never take off now, would it?
No, I mean, people would think they were absolutely stupid.
It's the same with like the royal family. You can say we're going to pick one family from somewhere in the country. We're going to put them in a huge palace in the centre of London. We're going to pay all their expenses, etc., etc.
You have to bow and scrape.
Yeah. Would you vote for this?
No, I mean it's like you couldn't make it up, could you? But
no.
But then it's like there's some kind of inertia thing, isn't there? Like
that's what I mean.
There,
yeah,
so you have
to. People have invested ideas. Yeah, a lot of ego and heritage. Yeah,
it's completely empty. Yeah. But it is interesting and good how people do change their minds. So talking about top politicians, I shouldn't just totally trash them all. Because do you remember Michael Portillo, who does the Great Train Journeys stuff now, which is good fun? But he was Tory Defence Secretary, I think, in the 1990s under Mrs. Thatcher. At which time they were actually bringing in the first Trident submarines. So he was responsible and involved around that. But then, later on, he turned against them, and he's anti-Trident, an anti-Trident replacement now. And Des Brown, he was the Labour Defence Secretary in 2006 when the question of the replacement first went to Parliament. And he argued in favour strongly and all that sort of thing. But then later on, after he was come out of the post and all that, he began to get involved in what's called a high-level initiative, i.e. like top statespeople, supposedly, who were opposed to nuclear weapons and trying to shift the agenda on them. So he became involved in that. And actually, he's done some very interesting work over the last few years. And he says that actually, by the time they produce the replacement, it will already be obsolete, because he said the thing about the subs, I mean, you said this yourself, they're going round underground and so on. Not underground, they're going, sorry,
that's the newer models, they can go underground too.
They're going around under the sea, and you can't target them. That was the whole thing, that they're, secret, undetectable, state of the art and all that sort of thing. He said, well, maybe that was the case like 50 years ago or whatever, or even more recently. But he said now there's so much money invested in underwater drone technology. The idea that you'll be able to keep secret where this massive, great big metal thing is in the sea, when you've got massive underwater drones and, detector technology and all that kind of thing. He said, and the idea also that, your systems, computer systems aren't hackable. New technology is moved on. Everything's moved on, and it's like we're still stuck with nuclear subs that first came in the 1960s or something. It's like they need to look at actually what the real problems are in security terms for us, human security, and not just think, let's keep on having this thing, this very expensive, very destructive thing. But he changed his mind, and a lot of them do change their minds. They just have to be open-minded and look at reality.
It's a shame they don't change their minds before they go into politics, though. Maybe they should be. They should be made to travel.
Have you ever thought about going into politics?
No, but I think it should be one of those things like jury service that you get called up to do. You should get people to do politics who don't want to do it.
That's quite an interesting idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
Everyone would have a go.
Yeah. Have you? Well, what about you?
No, I couldn't go into politics, I don't think. I mean, I like campaigning, for a cause and all that sort of thing.
How long have you been? You've been since, for many years, a campaigner.
Yeah, I've been involved in CND for about 20 years now. And it's interesting because the core issue is there, like Britain has nuclear weapons, we've got to get rid of them. We need global abolition of nuclear weapons. That's the two core things. But other things are related to that. So when I was first chair of CND, like from the early 2000s, there was the build up to the war in Iraq, and then there was all the intervention in the Middle East, and so many people were killed, so much destruction. Then you had the development of terrorism and ISIS coming out of that, and so on. So that was disastrous. So we became involved to some extent in the anti-war work at that time, obviously because maybe you're too young to remember Tony Blair saying,
I remember.
We have to attack Iraq because they've got weapons of mass destruction, and they can, giving the impression that they were going to have nuclear weapons that could destroy us in 45 minutes, and that wasn't the weapons inspectors went there and there was nothing, nothing.
It was years. They made a small mistake. It was 45 years.
Yeah, probably. I mean, and then it turned out it was the dodgy dossier and all that sort of stuff. But, because they really brought the whole kind of weapons of mass destruction thing to the fore. So we were very involved in that. And then obviously, climate change stuff. We do a lot of work around. The campaign title is "Climate, Not Trident." Put our money into dealing with climate change, not wasting it on Trident. And then 10 years ago, when there was the Tories came in first, the coalition government, and they had their austerity. After the global economic crash, they had their austerity policies, which meant you cut social services and cut all the things that made life bearable for people and all that, cut the NHS. So we had an NHS Not Trident campaign. So let's spend money on the NHS.
Anything but Trident.
Exactly. Yeah, jobs not Trident, education not Trident, student CND, it had books not bombs, And actually, NHS not Trident is probably the most popular slogan that we've ever had.
So how do you feel? How do you feel like personally after all these years? You have maybe when you were young or you're a student, you have all this pent up, the energy, and you're very, emotional about it. But how do you feel about this situation now personally?
Well, I seem to be an optimistic type. I don't quite know why. Probably my mum brought me up nicely or something. Lots of love, but anyway, I'm an optimistic person. I have a lot of confidence in what people can do when they are together and when they are working together. And yes, over the last years, it's like I feel like the people, ordinary people, have really been under attack, and through things like spending cuts, like removal of rights, all kinds of ways in which ordinary people, their lives, their possibilities, their hopes and dreams and so on, they are diminished by decisions of government. And that happens pretty much, a lot of places. It's not unique to Britain. So I feel as though we've been through a lot of setbacks. But within that, you always see the most amazing human spirit coming to the fore. I mean, it's like with the pandemic, it's like a recent example. Here we are hit with this most terrible thing. And particularly at the start, because I guess we're all a bit more used to it now, but at the start, the creative ways in which people found to support each other and to, kind of diminish the loneliness people were feeling, or find ways to make sure they have food and all that, and to bring a bit of joy into people's lives, and the social solidarity that we saw, as well. Just amazing. So it's like that is within the human spirit. And I believe very strongly in that. And also, if you look to the past as well, like all the progress that's been made, because ordinary people have always been under attack, actually, pretty much, if you think about it. But all the achievements, like men getting the vote, then women getting the vote, then the black community fighting for their rights, and the civil rights movement, and then lesbian and gay rights, and all these different things and ways in which people, can actually have democratic rights, opportunities. You had the National Health Service and all that kind of thing coming out of the horrors of the Second World War, the welfare state, like people, rising up and changing their lives. And I that's what I believe in, the power of people coming together to bring change.
That's beautiful, because I have to make this into a song. So, what particular angle to go for? That sort of, people making the change, people making the world they want to see. Because people are very, with the climate change now, people are very, you've got the Gretas in the world, and the people are very passionate about this, but, they'll think they've forgotten about the nuclear threat, because that's really still...
It's really dangerous. There, it's really there. We could be destroyed like in a few moments, literally we could be destroyed in a few moments. And I can understand why, for many people, it seems like it's on the back burner,
Yeah.
because the capacity is there, but they haven't been used in war, since 1945, thank God, So people think, oh, well, it's not going to happen, might happen, but not definitely. But people know that climate change is definitely happening. We are in that process of destruction already, and there's still time to pull it back, so I can understand why people have that kind of priority in their minds, maybe particularly young people, because they can see it happening so rapidly around them. But it's a question of people understanding how interlinked the two things are, but how they can both bring us, down to nothing. They can both destroy everything, humanity and all.
Do you think all the nuclear testing, when they tested all these bombs for years, do you think they contribute to global warming as well?
They might well do. I hadn't really thought about it like that. I mean, that you're absolutely right that until early 1960s, literally hundreds of nuclear weapons, massive ones, some 1,000 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb, they were tested in the atmosphere. Now, since then, they've mostly been underground, but nevertheless, that has an impact. But imagine that in the atmosphere. And, I mean, this is totally unscientific, what I'm going to say, but you have to wonder about the health impacts of so many nuclear radioactive bombs being exploded in the atmosphere. And it is statistically shown that there were kind of cancer spikes around, some of the testing. But I mean, there are lots of other places where no doubt it wasn't measured, but mustn't that have had an impact on human health in the subsequent decades? And actually,
there were miniature suns in the atmosphere.
Well, exactly. There's been one of the things in the treaty, the ban treaty, is about, it's not been in other treaties. It's really fantastic. It's about how countries that have tested nuclear weapons or brought harm to humans as a result of nuclear stuff, they have to make good and recompense. Okay, so that's really important. It also includes environmental remediation, which is that they have to, make good environmentally as well as in terms of what's happened to humans. And that's actually a very interesting thing, because a lot of the tests, when they were done by countries with colonial lands, so to speak, in like the 40s, 50s and 60s, they did these tests in their colonies. So like France, as well as testing in like the Pacific, they also tested in Algeria. And so they let off a lot of nuclear tests in Algeria, actually during the war in Algeria, when the Algerians were fighting for their independence. And because of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, with these clauses in it, there's now been quite a lot of coverage of this, and it's really coming up as an issue that there should be restitution of these wrongs. These are great historic crimes. And Britain, one of the places where Britain did its nuclear testing was actually in southern Australia, as well as on islands and stuff, actually in southern Australia, and in the lands of the Australian First Peoples. Okay, so, these are huge crimes against humanity, just in the testing, never mind using them in war. But the idea that you can just go to somebody's land and let off nuclear weapons to test, it's unbelievable, really unbelievable. But it will be righted. That's what's going to happen.
You're a very positive person. That's great. Yeah. I'm actually a member. What got me more interested in? I'm a member of the Aetherius Society, and Dr. King, who founded it, he had in Fulham, in London. He staged one of the first marches, anti-nuclear marches. I think it was in 1958 or 1957. And it was also the oldest UFO organization. So there's this big link. It's a UFO organization as well. Yeah, and there's lots of UFO sightings. The Russians have had lots of UFO sightings around testing sites, and So I think they know what we're doing, and they're not happy.
Well, I mean, talking about, the Soviet testing sites as well. I mean, they tested in Kazakhstan, what's now Kazakhstan, an independent country, and I mean, I've met people from Kazakhstan, who are impacted, as a result of radiation and birth defects as a result of the radiation from the tests. It's just terrible. It's an appalling stage in human history, the whole atomic thing, and the sooner that it's over, the better. It's caused so much terrible suffering and destruction. Awful.
Oh, well, okay. I think I'm inspired enough. If I reach any higher level of inspiration, I don't think I could be dangerous to human health as well. So,
okay. Well, it's been lovely talking to you.
It's been really. Thanks so much for your time, Kate, and thank you for the years and years of work you've done. I mean, it's with people like you. I mean, we're all, I love peace, and I am very happy. I protect my peace, as you can see from I'm very protective of my peace. But I'm not out. You're really working for peace every day on our behalf. So thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for your kind words. I really appreciate it. And, onwards.
All right, Kate. Have a great day.
Bye.
Ordinary people feel under attack, and that the enemy's invisible, they can't fight back. So they focus on an issue that's important to them, but they forget about the worst thing that could happen to men. Global warming's irritating like a splinter compared to hunkering down for a nuclear winter. Don't let politicians blind you with their commotion. When you see missiles flying over, there's one issue you'd vote on. Make nuclear disarmament the thing you're locked on by asking all your leaders where they stand on the bomb. Cause if the bombs go off, no other issues matter. If the bombs go off, your life will be in tatters. If the bombs go off, you'll wish that you'd acted before. If the bombs go off, there's no way to vote them back. If the bombs go off, your world is going black. If the bombs go off, your overriding emotion will be regret. Only 9 countries have nuclear weapons, but any single one of them could end us in seconds. One determined hacker and security breached, a single crazy president with a button in reach, an angry dictator who won't be disarmed, some kind of malfunction that sets off an alarm. So many scenarios, can't think of them all. Of course the one you forget will be the fate we befall. The odds are all long, but the risk is so high, and there's no way back once they're all up in the sky. Cause if the bombs go off, no other issues matter. If the bombs go off, your life will be in tatters. If the bombs go off, you'll wish that you'd acted before. If the bombs go off, there's no way to vote them back. If the bombs go off, your world is going black. If the bombs go off, your overriding emotion will be regret. Nuclear war could lead to social improvement, with equal opportunity, freedom of movement. Freedom of speech will be a forgotten obsession when you're pushing round a shopping cart with all your possessions. There'd be no discrimination or judging by race after a massive fireball has burnt off your face. Cause if the bombs go off, no other issues matter. If the bombs go off, your life will be in tatters. If the bombs go off, you'll wish that you'd acted before. If the bombs go off, there's no way to vote them back. If the bombs go off, your world is going black. If the bombs go thanks for tuning in. I hope you got the idea behind the song, that whatever issue you're involved in, pick one animal welfare, instead of giving all your money to the local kennels to support stray dogs. The worst thing that can happen to them is nuclear war. So anything, it's just, and even if you live in another country, like you live in France, you say, I don't have nuclear weapons, but you're so close to the UK, it's worth you sending money to support the anti-nuclear campaign in England. You can go to cnduk.org and support Kate and her colleagues with a monthly subscription. And if everyone did that, it would help put pressure on the politicians and just help raise awareness. It's an investment, okay? Thanks Maurizio Sanicola, Massimino Vodza, my musicians, Dori Voba, my researcher, you the listener. Check out the song on Spotify, iTunes, Deezer, or www.podsongs.com. And please rate and review the podcast. Thanks. Ciao.